Welcome back. I'm attorney Thomas Burton. In today's topic, I want to discuss single member LLC taxation as a disregarded entity. So this term disregarded entity means that a single member LLC, the default tax status is flow-through taxation, meaning there's no tax at the entity level. It flows through to the individual members' individual income tax return. And you'll sometimes hear an LLC, a single member LLC, referred to as a single member LLC taxed as a sole proprietorship. This is language used in the tax industry and by the IRS, but I feel it can be confusing because individuals can say to me, wait a minute, I'm an LLC, not a sole proprietorship. So the legal status is how you form your LLC, and an LLC is created under state law, a limited liability company. So it's important to understand you can be a limited liability company, but taxed as if you were a sole proprietorship, similar, but you are an entity, you are a separate corporate entity under state law. So this is where federal tax law and state law intersect. And to illustrate, I'm going to take you to the IRS website here and show you this is where you apply for an EIN, and they ask what type of legal structure is applying for an EIN. So if I choose sole proprietor up here, these are all the choices: sole proprietor, partnership, corporation, limited liability company, estate, trust. So for today, we're focusing on LLC taxation. But if I do sole proprietor, the IRS will tell you a sole proprietorship is a business that has only one owner and is not incorporated or registered with the state as a limited liability company. So this is when you have no separate legal existence. You're operating business as a sole proprietor, no distinction between the assets and liabilities of the business and yourself. A sole proprietor can be self-employed or independent contractor, and they would report business and income on Schedule C, E, or F. A sole proprietor may or may not have employees. So that's the example of sole proprietor, but we're going to go back and say we're applying as a limited liability company. And a limited liability company is a structure allowed by state statute and is formed by filing articles of organization with the state. So this is where you would want to file your LLC first before you get your EIN. But then if we click continue, they discuss what is a limited liability company, which is a structure allowed by state statute. Formed by filing articles of organization with the Secretary of State. But in Wisconsin, it's the Department of Financial Institutions, so each state has its own office. For federal tax purposes, an LLC may be treated as a partnership or a corporation, or be disregarded as an entity separate from its owner. An LLC can have two or more members or one member, single member LLC. So we're talking about a single member LLC. So we're an LLC, and then you click continue. How many members? And this is where you would click 1. You would put 1, and in our example, Wisconsin. Now, this is the page you will get from the IRS. And they will say, due to the number of members in your company, limited liability company, you are considered a single member LLC. Since you are a single member LLC, you will initially be classified as a disregarded entity for the purposes of filing a federal tax return. So that's where you're going to see that disregarded entity language. If the only member is an individual, a person, the LLC income and expenses are reported on Form 1040 on either Schedule C, E, or F. Now, if you don't want to be taxed as a disregarded entity, you can opt out by electing corporate status or electing S-Corp status. That's a topic for a different day, but most individuals are going to start with single member LLC as a disregarded entity similar to a sole proprietorship. So single member LLC may not file a partnership return. So I'm just showing you where this language comes from the IRS. And I'll go back on camera here. And that's where you're going to hear this single member LLC taxed like a sole proprietorship or taxed as a taxed as a disregarded entity. So now I'm going to, we want to go back to IRS, but I'm going to take you to this little illustration I created in Paint. Here we go. So this is a single member LLC taxed as a disregarded entity. So in my illustration, I'm showing you here on the left. Here's Sally Smith, sole proprietor. She has no separate entity under state law. She's operating as a sole proprietorship. So when she makes money with the business, it's going to be on Schedule C of Form 1040. So she'll have her income minus expenses equals profit. Then the profit from that sole proprietorship will go up to her individual income tax return on line 8 under other income. So if she has wages, that's up there first, dividends, interest, and then line 8, the profit or loss from the business. Now let's go over here to a single member LLC. Instead of Sally Smith, sole proprietor, she forms Smith Painting LLC under Wisconsin law, and she is Sally Smith, the sole member. That's how she will be referred to in IRS parlance, and for tax reasons and legal reasons, she's the sole member. So as a single member LLC and the sole member, again, if she doesn't opt out of the default status, which the default is flow through taxation as a disregarded entity, all the income and profits and loss from the business, she'll record them on Schedule C. It'll say Smith Painting LLC at the top and have an EIN number generally. I recommend, you're not required to get one as a single member LLC, but it's often a good idea for banking purposes. And again, the gross income minus expenses will be the profit, and the profit would flow to line 8 on the individual income tax return. So I thought it was helpful to visualize this, that we can have two different structures under state law, a sole proprietorship, which, just as a reminder, a sole proprietorship has no separate legal existence. That means if the sole proprietor dies, the business dies with them. Whereas an LLC has a perpetual life, allowing the company to outlive the founder. In addition, the LLC, when properly maintained, can put that distinction between business assets and liabilities and form that limited liability protection around the business from the personal assets. With the sole proprietorship, there's no legal distinction between the personal assets of Sally Smith and her sole proprietorship, so it exposes her personal assets to any risks of the business. So this is a simple illustration, and I'll go back on camera here, but I'm just trying to illustrate for you how you can have a sole proprietorship or an LLC, and the tax status can be exactly the same as a disregarded entity. Both flow through to you on your individual income tax return. And in this example, I used a painting business, so it flows through to Schedule C. But I can understand the confusion because the IRS uses certain language about disregarded entities. You'll read articles, they'll talk about LLCs taxed as a sole proprietorship. But if you are a single member LLC and you put your thinking cap on, remember, I am an LLC. I am a limited liability company. That language about being taxed like a sole proprietorship is just referring to the tax status under the eyes of the IRS. under federal tax law. It doesn't mean that I don't have a separate company. I have a separate legal entity, company, under state law. So for legal purposes, you are a limited liability company, and then your tax status is determined by what you elect with the IRS. And for a single member LLC, the default status is flow-through taxation as a disregarded entity. And as I mentioned earlier, you can opt out of that to be taxed as either a corporation or an S-corp, but that's something you would want to do after considering carefully if there's tax benefit for you for doing so. But the purpose of today's video is to show that you can change from a sole proprietorship to a single member LLC and not have to necessarily change anything about how you would file your taxes. And just to help you understand how those terms are used by the IRS and by state governments and how they interact with each other. So I hope that paint illustration was useful as you think about these concepts. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.